When it comes specifically to the new interconnected DCU helmed by Gunn and Safran, there seems to be a lot of emphasis on the interconnectivity of it all and how it all connects and how it'll all have an established marking in each individual project that will be the biggest indicator that it's a part of the larger DCU instead of like an Elseworlds project. And amongst the different types of mediums or media that will be implemented in this interconnected canon or continuity, gaming is something that Gunn has specified as something they're trying to delve into, and they actually right now have a couple of games in development, or at least a AAA game in development that will be connected to the DCU. Unfortunately, he did state that these games, with their narratives and their story, that they wouldn't be like essential pieces of the puzzle, as if like if you don't play these games then you're missing out on a huge part of the story's continuity or any type of grand event that it's leading up to. Like you're not gonna be missing any key information. It's just more so kind of like side stories or like cool adventures that could be conveyed through the gaming medium. And Warner Brothers games themselves have stated that they're gonna have a larger push for like their 4 biggest IPs for gaming, that being like DC, Mortal Kombat, Game of Thrones, and Harry Potter. But when it specifically comes to the DC side of things, that they have been actively working with Gunn and Safran on core franchises within the DC universe to help create more games centered around that. And they'll kind of have like a mix of like some live service games and then kind of stuff they've been kind of doing with like the single player stuff, narrative driven AAA games. And the good news with that, and some of my initial concerns, was that would there be a priority to make an upcoming DC game connected to the DCU instead of it's like a standalone game set in its own universe. So for example, if they make a Superman game, my initial concerns would be that it would have to be tied into the larger DCU if they made like a Green Lantern game. But they did state that they're not going to feel obligated to have it be connected to that larger universe. They only want to make games that make sense strategically for the fans and like the consumer. Overall, I am intrigued on the idea of DCU games. I just hope the fact that if a development studio is interested on working on a DC title, don't force them to make it a part of the DCU, as the biggest issue with tie-in games or with like movie tie-in games and stuff is continuity, and a lot of the creative freedom and stuff that could be cool gameplay wise or narrative sense is very limited. Like you're very limited on what you can do. And if they were to, for example, make a Superman game, they would have to have essentially the same actors do the voice acting, as that is something that James Gunn put emphasis on, is having the same actors reprise the roles in both live action and animation or whatever other medium. It'd have to make sense gameplay wise that you can't have Superman do a power move that he's never been shown to do in any of the DCU projects. You can't do too much with characters that would like break something that would happen in like a theatrical or a TV show. So it kind of just begs the question of how far are they willing to go with these certain games, and more specifically, what will these games center upon? What will they be about? Are they going to focus on the larger characters that are going to be the front runners of this universe, like Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, etc., the Justice League maybe? Or are they going to be like kind of side stories centered on lesser characters that don't impact the universe on a larger scale? So for example, like would they make like an Animal Man game or something that, let's say, he hasn't been introduced into the DCU yet, and then you could make a game kind of centered around that, very standalone. And I'm not saying that necessarily they have to focus on lesser known characters, but they should focus on aspects of the DC universe that aren't necessarily as well known, because if you try to do something grand via a video game, I feel like you kind of alienate some of the core audience that needs to watch or absorb that type of story if it does fit into the larger narrative of the DCU. So if you make like a major team up with the Justice League, you'd probably want that to be a movie, because now you already have a bunch of the core fan base that kind of gets pissed on the idea of, oh, now I have to buy like $70 plus video games just to understand the story. So I don't think it'll be like that, but maybe akin to like prequel stories. I think a really good idea would be to have essentially, if like, let's say for the Batman, for example, this is a seasoned Batman and you're going to introduce Damian Wayne, maybe you could have like a game kind of going over some of the timeline of the Bat family mythos and some of the villains he's encountered. Maybe you could go over like Bruce's training, or have his dynamic with like Batman and Dick Grayson as Robin, maybe like an Under the Red Hood kind of thing. Or maybe you could have stuff with like maybe like the Titans, for example, if they do happen early in this universe. But I guess you could argue that also would fit into the problem of that's a big enough story that would justify it being like a movie instead, as you would want to reach as much of a large audience as possible for a story like that. And just for the DC gaming side of things in general, I just really hope that they do what Marvel is doing, like have like a publishing company that is just solely focused on licensing these characters to other video game developers, so we can have more DC games. Like Marvel's just pumping out content. They've announced so many games that are in development from different developers, like with Bethesda with Blade, Insomniac working on Wolverine, Spider-Man 3, and a bunch of other X-Men titles, EA working on a Black Panther game and an Iron Man game, Skydance New Media working on the Black Panther Captain America hybrid game set in World War II. It's like, where's that treatment for DC? Really, the only 2 games on the horizon right now are Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League and Monolith's Wonder Woman, and we haven't heard zilch about that game since 2021 2021. The biggest problem with DC gaming throughout these past years is them solely relying on WB Games Montreal and Rocksteady, and it's been a minute since either one of them have released their last games prior to the release of like Gotham Knights and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. You got the most iconic superhero of all time, Superman, and no modern video game in sight. Where's the Flash game? Where's the Green Arrow game? We are living in a modern era where the Suicide Squad get a full AAA video game before the Justice League games themselves, and it's centered on trying to kill the Justice League. And I'm just gonna speak, for myself. I don't even care about like the live service push. I don't care for that. I don't want it. I think it's just a really bad idea to turn some of these really big IPs in a live service so that they can make as much revenue as possible. But it's ironic because if you look at the sales numbers for some of these games, the ones that are just single player narrative driven sell more than the ones that are live service. I mean, look at like, the Spider-Man games versus Avengers. No one liked Avengers because it was live service and had heavy microtransactions. So like, don't even worry about that. If you want your money, just make a good game. That's all you really gotta do.